Hey, well, good morning. I'm so glad to see all of you today here in Houston, Texas. Um, I just wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit today with you about everyone's favorite topic, which is industrialization. I feel like we've talked about industrialization for a while, but now we're going to be talking a little bit about some non-Western responses, non-European responses to industrialization. For industrialization, one of the things that we've seen is that we mentioned yesterday there were some reforms that people wanted to change some of the bad things they saw about industrialization. We saw that some intellectuals wanted to not just have reforms, but they wanted to have full-on revolution when it came to the industrial revolution. There was people who also responded with wanting not reforms but revolution. For example, like this communist revolution. We talked about Karl Marx yesterday and how Marxism, communism, and a related economic philosophy, socialism, are actually increasingly popular in today's world. That is one of the things that we mentioned yesterday, these different responses to the Industrial Revolution. And so now I'm going to transition a little bit about Europeans. We talked about white Europeans in the United States trying to push for more voting, white Europeans or white Americans as well, pushing for more voting, for changes in how children are instead of us being at home online. There was a time when people who were young, 16, were in factories, So what a change there's been. But I want to talk about today 3 non-European responses to industrialization. I want to talk about the Ottomans. I'm going to talk about a group of people called Boxers, and I want to talk about a group of people called the Samurai. And so those 3 groups of people, the Ottomans, the Boxers, and the Samurai, they're actually going to take us to 3 countries in 3 different ways that people are responding. How are the Ottoman Empire going to respond to industrialization? How is China going to respond to industrialization? How is Japan going to respond to industrialization? We've already talked a little bit about how Japan responds to the Industrial Revolution, and so some of that will not be new. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the Ottomans. How are the Ottoman Empire responding to industrialization? Well, it says that during the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in decline. This is not a new thing for us to see. We've seen this theme before of the Ottoman Empire been in decline. They at some point in the 1500s and the 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was on the rise, but that really is kind of like come to a conclusion. The Ottoman Empire is losing land. We mentioned that at some point the Europeans are okay ganging up on the Ottoman Empire. They help support a country called Greece to earn its independence. We talked about nationalism some time ago, and we talked about that, nationalism, this intense pride in your country, and how nationalism brought some parts of the world together, like Germany being brought together under nationalism. We talked about Italy being brought together under nationalism, but then we also talked about how if nationalism is intense pride of your ethnic group, what happens if you're an empire made of 20 different ethnic groups? That's what is the problem with nationalism in places like the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire has all these different groups. And so nationalism starts tearing them apart in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire was in decline. And we also know that the Ottoman Empire had earned itself a name. We've actually talked about this before. It earned the nickname of the sick man of Europe. That was like the nickname that the Ottoman Empire had. It was called the sick man of Europe. And that's because, the Ottoman Empire, like modern Turkey, is kind of in this world where it's kind of in Asia and kind of in Europe. There is a small part of the Ottoman of Turkey today that is in Europe, but most of the Ottoman Empire is in Asia. But still, because of that European foothold, the Ottoman Empire earns this name of the sick man of Europe. It's in decline. It is on the edges of Europe. It controls a small part of Europe, but the Ottoman Empire, compared to the rest of Europe, it is really much in decline. So what to do in a situation like this? Well, the Sultan Mahmud II, he was opposed by a group of people we've talked about before called the Janissaries. And you might remember that the Janissaries, these were powerful slave soldiers. And that might sound like a contradiction, but in the Muslim world, slavery looked a lot different in some places than it did in the Atlantic economy. In the Muslim world, you have slaves doing things that you would not do openly and traditionally in the Atlantic Christian European slave trade networks. For example, in the Muslim world, it was not uncommon to have slaves to be soldiers. For example, in the Muslim world, it was not uncommon for slaves to openly be concubines. Now, for sure, in the Atlantic, in the American, in this European slave trade, there was sexual relationships that happened between masters and their slaves, but a lot of that was not openly practiced. It was not openly advertised, but in the Muslim world, that was not a big deal. You might remember that even the Prophet Muhammad had slaves, the Prophet Muhammad had concubines, and the idea was that if Muhammad is the most perfect man who ever lived, it could not be wrong for what he did to own a slave and to have a concubine, which is why I think the last country in the world to practice slavery openly and officially was the country of Mauritania, a northwest African country. I think they had slavery to like the 1970s. So the same decade that I was born, slavery was still legally permissible in a Muslim nation. And so we see some of these countries were kind of slow to get rid of it. And so in the Ottoman Empire, not only were they having slaves doing really odd, unusual things like being slave soldiers, they actually got really powerful. These slave soldiers actually, because you might remember the Janissaries, they were the group of people that used guns. And because they were the ones that used guns, they actually grew to be very powerful. It says that these Janissaries, they were powerful slave soldiers. And so the Sultan knew that if I want to modernize, if I want to become more powerful, I got to get rid of my rivals. And so he immediately gets rid of the Janissaries. And it says that he replaced them with a military trained by Europeans. That he replaced them with a military trained by Europeans. And that's the thing, really, is that with so many of these non-European countries, if you want to modernize, if you want like the best, you're going to kind of be looking to the people who are already successfully walked down the road of modernization. And that's going to be really the Europeans, and that's really going to be the Americans. And so that's what he looks to do as well. He gets rid of these traditionally important, successful slave soldiers, the Janissaries, they're out, and he brings in the Europeans to start training his military. And there's a word for this period of reforms. There's a word for this period of westernization. These reforms are called the Tanzimat, and they had the goal of having Western-style reforms. That was the goal. Their goal was having Western-style reforms. Whenever we talk about the West, we're not talking about like, cowboys and Indians that like sometimes we think about, the West. When we talk about Westernization, we talk about Western powers, or just simply talking about the West, we're talking about Europe and the United States and Canada for sure. Those countries, these white-dominated countries that are really becoming the most powerful in the world, are what we mean when we talk about the West. And so the Ottoman Empire, they want to be not on the decline anymore. They want to kind of be relevant. And so they bring in Europeans. This period is called the Tanzimat, of having Western style reforms. And their greatest desire in the Tanzimat, their greatest desire is to basically copy Europe. That's like what they feel is their ticket to success. That's what they feel is what's going to do them the best is if they look who is winning, who's doing well in the world, they decide they want to their desires to copy Europe. Now, there's a couple of things that they're going to have to do to copy Europe, and these things are going to be kind of uncomfortable. One of the things they have to look at is the school system in the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a Muslim empire. We've talked about in the past that there was 3 land-based Muslim empires: the Ottoman Empire, modern-day Turkey, the Safavid Empire, modern-day Iran, and the Mughal Empire, modern-day India. Now, the Ottoman Empire was a Sunni majority empire. The Safavids was a Shia majority empire. And the Mughals were also Sunni, but kind of different, kind of weird, because the Mughals were an example of a Muslim majority ruling the Mughals in India was an example of a Muslim minority ruling a Hindu majority. Now, for the Ottomans, though, it was Sunni Islam. And, like many Muslim countries, your education began and ended with you going to a religious school where one of the most important topics, one of the most important subjects that you'll learn is the Quran. One of the most important subjects, one of the most important topics that you'll be exposed to is the Hadith, is Sharia law. That was like kind of what much of education was for people in the Ottoman Empire. But if I want to copy Europe, I need to start moving away from that kind of Islamic religious training where I'm mainly educating people in the Quran, and I need to be looking at doing things the way Europeans do it. It says that they replaced religious Islamic schools with secular schools. This is a theme that we've seen before. This word secular means non-religious. Our high school is a secular school. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't be a religious person. It doesn't mean you can't be a Muslim or a Christian or Jewish. It just means that the schools are not pushing that as their primary way of dealing with knowledge. You can be a Christian, Jewish, or Muslim person at a public school in the United States, but we're not going to be doing the 5 prayers, Islamic prayers. We're not going to start off by praying to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. We're not going to have statues of Hindu gods set up in public places. It's a secular school. You as a private individual, that school can be a Christian, Jew, Hindu, whatever, but publicly as an institution, the school has no commitments to that. And that's what they're trying to do. They're replacing these religious schools in the Ottoman Empire with secular schools. And there's a couple of things we also want to stress in these secular schools. There's some topics I really would like to invest into, especially if we want to modernize, especially if we want to westernize. That's great that we used to study the Quran and the Hadith, but that's not going to help me to compete with Europe. It says that these new schools stress topics like engineering. These new schools stress topics like engineering. Engineering is going to be incredibly important because you know what Western Europe has done right? You know what the United States has done right? They've built rail, they've built telegraph networks, and all those things are going to require a knowledge of mathematics, engineering, to build bridges, to build high rises. These are all things that we need engineers. And I might need to bring in American engineers, or I might need to bring in European engineers for a time. But if I want to do well, the best thing I could do is to train my own engineers to make these changes in my society. So that's one of the things that they start having. It says that they also, new laws were passed making it easier for foreigners to do business in the Ottoman Empire. They wanted, to some degree, to attract Europeans to come in. They wanted to make it easier for non-Muslims, for Europeans to come in and do business in the Ottoman Empire. They thought that foreigners brought technology, foreigners brought trade, and there was some openness to this during the Tanzimat period. And also, they decided not just to change the school system, they decide not just to change some laws, but they decide to change the legal system as well. It says that new laws, it says that all people were now under the same secular laws. That all people were now under the same secular laws. Again, it used to be in the Ottoman Empire that Muslims, well, you were held accountable to Islamic laws. Christians, you would not have to be held accountable in the same way to those. Jews, you would not have to be held accountable in the same way to those laws. There'd be different religious courts to deal with different religious communities. Well, the Ottoman Empire said, well, that's not really European. The Europeans and the Americans, not like the Americans have okay, well, this is a court system for Catholics, and this is a court system for Calvinists, and this is a court system for Baptists. That's not how the United States is set up. And that's definitely not how Europe was set up. And so the Ottomans say, well, we're going to get rid of this idea of every religious community gets their own laws and their own courts. That's it's kind of ridiculous. That's not very modern, not very Western. So they replaced that. Everyone is going to be based under the same secular laws. This changed the role of traditional religion-based, the role of traditional religion-based Islamic courts. There used to be these Islamic courts that determined everything from inheritance rights to property disputes to divorce. And these traditional religious courts that were so important begin to fade away. It changed the role of traditional religion-based Islamic courts. There's a name for that kind of law. You might remember that law based on the Quran and law based on the Hadith. The Hadith is the traditions of the thing that Muhammad the Prophet said or the things that the Prophet Muhammad did. That those laws based on the Quran and Hadith are called Sharia. And Sharia law had actually had some really incredible rights granted to women. Sometimes people look at Islam and say uncritically that Islam 100% reduced the rights of women, and that's just really not true. For example, when the Prophet Muhammad was in Arabia, it was really common for you, if you had a baby girl, to basically abandon your baby girl out in the desert, out in the wilderness, and let the baby die of exposure. The Prophet Muhammad said that was not right, and he made it against the law to kill baby girls. That's one example of how Islam elevated the rights of women. But there's another example of how Islam elevated the rights of women. It says that Sharia law had allowed women to own property. That Sharia law had allowed women to own property. That was actually something that Muhammad fought for, that Muhammad thought was only right, that when your father died, that you could inherit property, you could own property. And it didn't have to go to your next male relative or whatever. So Sharia law had argued for that. But now what happens when I'm getting rid of Sharia law? When I look to the United States, when I look to Europe as my example, you know what we're not seeing? We're not seeing a really strong example or model of women having the right to own property. It says that as a result of this, new secular laws took away this right. New secular laws took away this right. So this is an instance that trying to become more like Europe, trying to become more like the Americans actually hurts some elements of women's rights. New secular laws took away this right. And the Ottoman Empire was also, even though they were making these changes, there was some concern about and people even being afraid that reforming too quickly could hurt the empire. There was some concern that reforming too quickly could hurt the empire. So in all cases, whenever you're an empire, whenever you're a government, sometimes it's helpful for you to identify people that you can blame as troublemakers. Sometimes it's helpful for you, if you are an empire, if you are a dictatorship, for you to identify people that you can say, these are the troublemakers. These are the people we need to watch out for and be concerned for. You see that pattern, for example, leading up to World War II, where Adolf Hitler looks at and blames the Jews. The Jews are a really good group of people to blame. In Uganda, under the leadership of Idi Amin, this dictator of Uganda looks to the Indians, people from India that had come over as business people, said, oh, these are the people we're blaming. We're going to kick out the Indians from Uganda. So it's always a strategy of empires and dictators to pick a group of people that you can blame for all the things that have gone wrong. And that's what the Ottomans looked to as well. One group called the Young Turks, who advocated reforms, were actually kicked out of the empire. These people, the Young Turks, they were arguing for modernization. This group of people, the Young Turks, were arguing for westernization, and maybe they argued for it and pushed for it a little bit too much, because the Young Turks, they were actually kicked out of the Ottoman Empire. Also, the Ottoman Empire began to limit freedoms of minority groups. They began to limit freedoms of minority groups. And typically at this time, this is when we talk about the persecution of Jews, and there were no doubt persecution of Jews, but the group of people that was probably hurt the most by the Ottomans was a different group of people. In fact, it says from 1894 to 1896, in a short period of time, the Ottoman Empire persecuted and killed Armenians who were Christians. There was a group of people, we've actually talked about them before, called the Armenians, and the Armenians were Christians. They're mainly based in a region, there's a country today called Armenia, and they had early on embraced Christianity. We've talked about that. Christianity is not a white European alone religion. Christianity is an example of a universal religion, that it doesn't matter what your color or your ethnic group or your language, anyone can become a Christian. There's a couple of universal religions. Islam is a good example of a universal religion. There's more Muslims outside of the Middle East than in the Middle East. I think the Asian country of Indonesia has more Muslims in it than the entire Middle East. Islam is an example of a universal religion. Buddhism is an example of a universal religion. You can be white, you can be brown, you can be black, you can be anything and be a Buddhist. And Christianity is the same way as well. There are, for sure, at this time in the 1900s, the majority of of Christians are in Europe and in the Americas, but also there's some really important non-European centers of Christianity, like in Africa, Ethiopia, one of the oldest non-Christian country, one of the oldest Christian countries of the world, Ethiopia, not a European country, and Armenia as well. And these Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, they get persecuted. In fact, it says the Ottoman government killed about 250,000 Armenian Christians. 250,000 Armenian Christians are killed, 250,000. And sadly, these are acts of genocide against the Armenian people. And we're going to actually see more of this continue as the Ottoman Empire goes into the 20th century. Genocide against the Armenian people. And this is something that actually even Turkey still denies ever happened, even though there's photographic evidence of it. There's good documentary evidence that genocide happened against them. And Adolf Hitler actually looked at the Armenian genocide as inspiration to some degree. And, the truth is that I would bet that most of us have never heard of the Armenian genocide, of at least 250,000 Armenians being killed, and then later even more Armenians being killed. And Adolf Hitler argued that if the world has forgotten about the Armenian genocide and has actually, done nothing really about it, there's like a short-term memory when it comes to genocide. If the world has forgotten about the Armenian genocide, Hitler thought and argued that the world might be outraged for a moment about a Jewish genocide, but the world would then soon forget. And, there's some interesting point that Hitler is making, is that we sometimes have historical amnesia. We don't remember the death of 250,000 Armenians and then thousands more. We remember the Jewish genocide, partly because there's so much memorialization of that in movies and in film and in books. But, what's a movie about the Armenian genocide? You know what? There's none that I know of, that I'm aware of. What is, this is April It was in April in Rwanda. This is actually the time in Rwanda people are remembering the genocide that happened, I think, 26 years ago. I think other than the movie Hotel Rwanda, what is there a discussion of the genocide in Rwanda? Are people forgetting the role of genocide, and does that make it easier for it to happen? It says that there are not just the Ottomans who are thinking about reform and how to respond to it, but the Chinese are as well. The Chinese efforts at reform. In China, there was something called the self-strengthening movement. It was an effort to modernize China. So China has kind of had this interesting relationship with the West. At first they were this country that was so advanced, so far ahead, that when people like Marco Polo came to China and wrote about what China was like, people thought, man, Marco Polo, you're just full on lying. How could a country be so advanced, so modern? And other people looked at what this Italian Marco Polo wrote in the Middle Ages about China and said, wow, that sounds like a great place of wealth. We want to go there. Chris Columbus himself had a copy of Marco Polo's book and said, if that's what China's like, if that's what Asia's like, we need to sail there and we need to go there. And then China kind of goes period of having a lot of exports. They send tea to Europe, but there's really nothing they really want from the Europeans. There's a negative balance of trade, and the Europeans go from a kind of like a man crush on China, where they think China's like the best and so cool, and they just want to do business, to kind of like hating China and like thinking, gosh, you know what? We want stuff from you, but you don't want anything from us. We kind of hate you. And now that Europe is military ability to do something about it, Europe starts pushing and trying to take advantage. And the best example of that we call Opium Wars, and we studied. So we saw that China kind of realizes bit by bit, little by little, slowly by slowly, that they need to modernize. It says that Westerners were brought in to help with these reforms. That Westerners were brought in to help with these reforms. So they brought in Europeans, they brought in Americans, because just like the Ottomans, they knew who are the people that are doing modernization well. It's the Americans, it is the Europeans. If we want to be like them, we need to bring some of these people in. And so they do a little bit. And there was something that really had, really raised the awareness for China about the need for this to happen. And there was a war called the Sino-Japanese War. This was a single-year war between Japan and China. And a lot of times in world history classes or social studies classes, you'll see this term Sino, S-I-N-O. And that term Sino always means China. And so whenever you see that there's something called the Sino-Japanese War, it's the war between China and Japan. And traditionally, if you were to look at, who's going to win this kind of war? I mean, on one hand, you have Japan, which had been in the past part of what was called the tributary system, where they kind of said, look, you know what, China, you're better than us and you're bigger than us, and we don't deserve to be in the same sphere of friends as you. But now this turns out to have been a war that Japan, though it was smaller, actually won pretty well. It says that this was an example of a modernized Japan. It won a quick victory. A modernized Japan won a quick victory. And this kind of like was a wake-up call to China. Like, how could we lose in a single year to Japan? I mean, what does Japan do right? Well, you might remember, we've mentioned this before, Japan had gone through something called the Meiji Restoration, that Japan had modernized, that they had decided that they were going to learn the lessons of the Chinese. The Chinese had gotten beat up by the Europeans. The Chinese were being pushed around by the Europeans. And so Japan modernized in what was called the Meiji Restoration. That they went not only to modernizing, but they actually fought China and won. This was kind of a wake-up call. This modernized Japan won a quick victory. And this loss pushed China to modernize. This loss pushed China to modernize. And Europeans were also okay encouraging this, because really, if China's going to modernize and they're going to call in help, who are they going to call? They're going to call Europeans. And so Europe benefits from encouraging China to take these steps of westernization and modernization. The Europeans pushed elements of westernization in China because they thought they could benefit. They thought they could benefit. You know, Europe is not going to go over to China because, like, hey, we just want to help you out. We're just like, you know, just out of the goodness of our heart, going to help you. No, the only reason Americans or Europeans are going to go to China is because they think they could benefit in some way, and they did. It says one of the things they decided to get rid of was something that was really old-fashioned, that was like the way that you got a job with the government. And this had been the way how it was in China forever and ever and ever, that if the best jobs were government jobs. And if you wanted a government job, well, you had to go and sit and take this massive exam. And this exam required you to have memorized hundreds of pages of material. It was essay-based. It was a standardized test. And if you failed this test, some people experience mental breakdowns from the stress of this exam. And you might remember that that exam was called the Civil Service Exam. And there was a push to end the civil service exam. They thought, you know what, I don't know if that's really what is going to get us into the 20th century, is making sure that all of our intellectuals have memorized the Confucian classics. Let's go ahead and say, hey, we love the civil service exam. It's been part of our culture forever. That's not really what we need. That, you know, knowing classics isn't going to build any bridges. It's not going to modernize the army. So there was a push to end the civil service exam. Now, there was leaders in China that began to push back and question that, including a woman leader, the Empress Dowager. And what she does is she actually came to oppose efforts of modernization. This Empress of China, the Empress Dowager, she began to question, you know, okay, we've started down this road of modernization, but maybe we're going too fast. And maybe we're actually going to have too many Europeans coming in and too much European influence. And so she began to push the brakes on modernization. It says that she was actually against two types of technology that the Europeans were bringing in. She was against the expansion of rail and the telegraph. And you might remember from a previous lecture, those are two of the things that transformed the American West. That rail and telegraph not only allowed for communication with the American West, but allowed for the conquest of the American West. That rail and telegraph were actually what physically bound the American West together with the rest of the United States. And it also began to bind the entire world. Rail allowed for industrialization. Rail allowed for an international market, which made it possible for me to grow wheat in California, send it by boats, transporting it by rail to ports in San Francisco, and then get it into global markets. Rail allowed me as a migrant from Europe to settle in places like Nebraska or places like in Oklahoma, raise either cattle or grow wheat, and then by rail transport it hundreds of miles away. Rail and telegraph is what actually helped make the modern world possible. And it was things that Empress Dowager was against. She encouraged something called the Boxer Rebellion. And this Boxer Rebellion was a movement against Western missionaries and Chinese Christians. The Boxer Rebellion was a movement against Western missionaries and Chinese Christians. And so these guys were called the Boxers because they practiced martial arts. And they believed that it's not rifles, it's not bullets that's going to win the day. They believe that if we just go back to basics, if we fight the Europeans using martial arts, if we go back to traditional Chinese beliefs, we can get rid of the Europeans. And that's what the Boxer Rebellion was about. It was these traditional these conservative voices. A conservative is someone who doesn't want there to be any change. And these Boxers did not want a change to be like the Europeans. And the Empress was all for this rebellion. She encouraged the Boxer rebellion. And it was a movement against Western missionaries because tons of European missionaries, tons of American missionaries had moved to China trying to convert them to Christianity. You might remember that Christianity believes that no way to go to heaven except for by Jesus. And if that's the case, some Christians felt it's our obligation to go to places like China to share this Christian message with them. Well, they're the first, these Western missionaries in China trying to change China are some of the first people the Boxers want to attack, they want to get rid of. But then they also don't want to just attack the enemy from without, but they also want to attack the enemy from within. And what do you do if I'm willing to attack Christian missionaries who are white Europeans? Okay, that's an obvious target. What am I going to do with my fellow Chinese who've become Christians? What am I going to do with my fellow Chinese who've accepted Christianity? Aren't they basically traitors? Aren't they basically cultural traitors? Haven't they rejected who they really are? And if they rejected who they really are, is it really wrong to kill them? And the answer that the Boxer said was no, it's not wrong to kill Chinese Christians. In fact, it says some of the reasons why the Boxers were upset at the Western missionaries. Western missionaries had abused their extraterritorial rights to protect their congregants. That means church members, churchgoers, or associated people against lawsuits. That word extraterritorial is a black bold lettered vocabulary word. There's a related term called extraterritoriality. And that word, extraterritorial rights, meant that white Europeans who were in China could not be arrested by Chinese officials. That if there was ever a crime, if there was ever an accusation, if there was ever a lawsuit, Chinese officials did not have the right to pursue that against white Europeans. Extraterritoriality says that if I'm a white European in your country and there's a crime or accusation, another white European will investigate me. I will not be investigated by a Chinese member, a Chinese government official. Extraterritoriality means that white people will be held accountable by other white people, even living in a country like China. And a lot of Chinese people felt that's ridiculous. How's that even possible that you're in my country? If you break my laws or you're accused of doing wrong in my country, we can't even investigate you. There was the feel and the sense that some missionaries were abusing this extraterritorial right to get out of lawsuits and other legal issues. Boxers fought using martial arts and also believed in spirit possession. We've actually talked about this theme in world history a lot, of different cultures believing that there are spirits. There are good, there's positive spirits, there's negative spirits, but they also believed that it's possible that you can be possessed by spirits. And sometimes in Western culture in the United States, like if we talk about like demon possession, that comes off as bad, that comes off as a negative. You don't want that. But in so many different cultures, for example, we've looked at examples and videos in voodoo where you actually desire to be possessed by spirits. Some would say possessed by these demons, because these spirits give you insight, they give you knowledge that you would have access to other. And in China, they didn't say, hey, martial arts is going to be the trick that's going to help us defeat the Europeans. But the Boxers also believed in spirit possession by having spirits empower them and take over their bodies. And some argued that would even make them invincible to European bullets. This is something we actually even see in the 21st century. Even in 2018, 2019, 2020, there's groups that still believe in this kind of stuff. Groups that I'm personally familiar with are like militia groups in Africa, where they tell child soldiers, if we do these rituals, if we do these types of practices, no bullet will kill you. There's a a movie called Blood Diamond with Leonardo DiCaprio, and it talks a lot about child soldiers in Africa and some of the ways that they use kids and convince kids. There was a documentary by a group of people called Invisible Children that had a documentary about a group called the Lord's Resistance Army, where they told kids, yep, by spirits, you'll become invincible to bullets. And that's kind of what the Boxers believe too, that if they just had the faith and believed, these spirits would make it impossible for them to be shot and killed. How many Christians died in the Boxer Rebellion? We'll write down about 100,000 Christians were killed in the Boxer Rebellion. 100,000 Christians were killed in the Boxer Rebellion because they were seen as traitors to China. Well, Europe doesn't like this. Europe doesn't like, Europe identifies themselves as Christian, and any sort of action against Christianity or questioning Christianity is going to be something that's going to spur interest. But plus, this is also honestly just an opportunity for Europe to get involved in China. Any opportunity to get involved in one of the largest markets of the world, Europeans say, hey, sign me up, let's go ahead and go. And so we do see that an international force invaded and quickly defeated the Boxers. An international force invaded and quickly defeated the Boxers because the Boxers are relying on martial arts and spirit possession, and the Europeans have bullets and guns and cannon. China was forced to accept the protection of Europeans. This is like quote unquote protection. And Europe says, hey, listen, China, we don't want bad things to happen to you. Tell you what, we are willing to come into your country and protect you. And China, because of this humiliating defeat of the Boxer Rebellion, was forced to say, yes, we'll agree that you'll protect us. There's a famous photograph looking at the types of people that made up this international force. And there's two groups of people you should take note of and identify that are not identified. But this famous photograph has people lined up from left to right. And these are people who were part of this international force to invade and to deal with the Boxer Rebellion. The first person you have are the British. The British send soldiers. We're not surprised by that. They sent soldiers to the Opium War. The next is the United States. And that's kind of interesting because, the United States has been busy with the American West, with fighting the American Indian, that now the Americans are looking beyond the continental United States. The Americans are looking to build an empire, maybe not a physical empire necessarily, but definitely an empire of trade. And if that means sending soldiers to China, we'll send soldiers to China. Next to the United States, you have a soldier from Australia. Australia is not an independent country. It's a part of the British Empire, but they're forced to go. And then look at who we have after Australia. You have a non-European, a non-white soldier with a head covering. This individual, you should take note, is from India. This soldier, you should take note, is from India. And based on that head covering, you probably assume that they're part of a religion, that he's probably what we call a Sikh. Sikhs require their men to not shave their facial hair. They require their men to have a head covering. Sometimes Sikhs are confused for Muslims. After 9/11, there are some instances of Sikhs being targeted. People thinking they're Muslim, but they're not. They're this different religion in India. The Indians are there for one reason. They're there because they're part of the British Empire, and the British have taken over India, and they are moving in ways that are asking Indian soldiers to participate in these efforts. And so that's what we see happening here in this photograph. Next to this Indian, you have other individuals as well. You have the Germans. Again, the Germans after unification, they're getting involved, building an empire for their own. After that, you have France. After that, you have Austria. After that, you have Italy. Again, these are countries we've not really heard building an international presence. I mean, Germany has not really had an international presence before. Italy has not had. What has allowed Germany and Italy to do these sorts of things? Unification. Unification did. And then the last person in this list, and it's kind of interesting, the shortest person on this list as well, is a non-European, a non-Westerner. but they're dressed like a European. They're dressed like a Westerner. And who's that last country you should make sure you take note is Japan. We have two different non-European, two different non-white people participating in this Boxer Rebellion, this war to stop the Boxer Rebellion. You have an Indian going to war because India is part of the British Empire. You have a Japanese soldier participating, but not because they're trying to, not because they're owned by Europe and being pushed to it. The Japanese are there because the Japanese want what the Europeans want, to take advantage of China. We also see a map that is a map of Beijing, how it's color-coded. They actually divided up Beijing. You see all the different flags of the countries that are taking over Beijing. The British flag is there, the Spanish, the Americans, but even the Japanese flag is there. Of all the countries that have learned the lessons of modernization, it's the Japanese. The Japanese not only have avoided being conquered by white Europeans, but they are now conquering like Europeans. In fact, the Japanese do so well at modernization that they get to be taken, there's a photograph taken of them, not as soldiers being ordered by the British to do X, Y, and Z, but as fellow invaders taking over China. This occupation of Beijing was done by the French, the Americans, the Germans, and even the Japanese. This was for China a humiliating defeat. This Boxer Rebellion was a humiliating defeat. The Empress Dowager had thought we could resist Westernization. The Empress Dowager thought maybe we could push back against the Europeans. She supported the Boxers, and that turned out to be a mistake. It was a humiliating defeat for China. This is an example of the consequences of not embracing modernization. This is an example of the negative consequences of not embracing modernization. It turns out that in the 1800s, to say no to Europe, to say no to Westernization and industrialization, and to say, hey, I believe that these martial arts using spirit-possessed rebels can stop the advancement of Western civilization, turns out that that's not going to be possible. This is an example of the consequences of not embracing modernization. And this is also an example of the growing power of Japan. The growing power of Japan. Japan understands modernization is what you have to do. And by 1911, the dynastic cycle comes to an end. You might remember the dynastic cycles, the cycle that you have an emperor, things are great, they have the mandate of heaven, things slowly become corrupt, people get tired of the corruption, people rise up, brand new emperor. Things are great, things slowly get corrupt, people get tired of the corruption, people rise up, brand new emperor. That was called the dynastic cycle. That there was something called the mandate of heaven that went from emperor to emperor. It was like a permission slip to rule China. And we have the last emperor, a guy named with an interesting name. His name is Pu Yi. And Pu Yi was the last emperor of China. He was like a kid when he was the last emperor of China. And eventually China says, you know, we're going to get rid of what we've had forever. Pu Yi, this last child emperor of China, he's kicked off the throne. And it says that China became a republic. China became a republic. There's a movie about this called The Last Emperor. I'll put the trailer for that movie in the description video that kind of talks about this child emperor. As a kid, you know, even though he was a kid, he was treated as a god on earth. There's a video clip that, you know, even though he was a little kid and he would like have temper tantrums, people would like worship him, say, oh, can't correct the emperor who's like going through the terrible twos because he's like God on earth. Well, at some point, other members of Chinese society said, look, this is not going to work. You know, the rest of Europe is modernizing. They have factories and rail and telegraph. And some of us are like worshiping a 2-year-old as a god. We got to get rid of this kid, Pu Yi. I'll put this video in the description so you can see an example of them kind of worshiping this 2-year-old who has a temper tantrum. But they finally get rid of that and they decide to become a republic. Well, the last section we got to talk about is Japan. And even though Japan was in many ways a success of modernization, there were some people who felt left out. There was some resistance to reform in Japan. In 1871, there was a group of people that Japan realized we need to get rid of this group of people. Man, we love this group of people. They've been important forever, but we got to get rid of them. And this is a theme that we've seen before, like with the Ottomans. Remember, there was a group of people that were important forever, the Janissaries, but they were actually became a stumbling block. And we got to get rid of the Janissaries. In China, they were looking to these boxers using martial arts and demon possession to beat guns used by Europeans. That didn't work. And there's a group of people, you probably know them by name, who were traditional soldiers in Japan. These were people who were known for their bravery, for their swordsmanship, for their fighting skill. And that's great, but I don't need those types of people when we're in a world of guns and cannon and telegraphs and railroad. It says in 1871, Japan got rid of the samurai who had served as traditional soldiers. They got rid of the samurai who served as traditional soldiers. And some of these samurai protested these changes. You know, some of these samurai did not want to go away quietly. Some of these samurai protested these changes that they were some of the most respected, most revered, some of the most feared members of their society. And now we're changing all this and we're inviting white Europeans to come over and train us in the military. Not a lot of this. Some of the samurai rejected this. There's actually a movie about this with Tom Cruise. This was an Academy Award nominated movie called The Last Samurai, which is based on some true stories of how Japan invited various different types of white people to Japan to train their military, train their soldiers. Tom Cruise plays one of these Westerners who comes to Japan to modernize their army during this Meiji restoration. The Meiji period was this period of modernization in Japan. And some traditional members of society pushed back and rejected that. And that's what the theme of that movie, The Last Samurai, I'll put that video in the video description as well. You can check that out if you're interested. But that's what happens as well. They protest these changes. Despite their efforts, Japan quickly modernized. Despite their efforts, despite the protests of the samurai, Japan quickly modernized. Finally, and so that protest doesn't work, just like the Boxer Rebellion doesn't really work. Finally, a couple of patterns and we're done. The Ottoman Empire was the first to attempt modernization. That kind of makes sense. They're the closest to Europe. Their empire is falling apart very quickly. They had this reputation of being the second man of Europe. They know they need to change or they're going to die. They are the first to really modernize, and they later tried to limit some modernization in the Ottoman Empire. There was a sense that like, oh, well, we are modernizing, but this is going a lot quicker than we thought it would. And they later tried to limit and put the brakes on modernization. That looked a couple of different ways. For example, it looked like them, killing the Armenians, kind of looking for groups that they feared might be wanting too much independence, too much freedom as a result of modernization. So they were the first to start modernization, but then they kind of put the brakes on it. It says China's leadership was at first skeptical of reform, but after the Sino-Japanese War, understood the need to modernize. At first, the Chinese were against modernization. They didn't think it was good. But after the Sino-Japanese War, after losing to Japan, they saw the need to modernize. So China was very different. They were against it and then kind of realized, yeah, we probably shouldn't have things like the civil service exam. I think probably someone who knows physics and math is probably better at being an engineer than someone who memorized the Confucian classics. Japan's leadership was skeptical of reform, but after the Sino-Japanese War, understood the need. And finally, Japan's modernization was the most effective. Their modernization was the most effective, even if some conservative members, a conservative is someone who doesn't want massive societal change. And conservatives would be like the boxers in China. They don't want rail and telegraph and white Europeans coming in and changing everything. Conservatives in Japan were the samurai. And despite some conservative members will write down, they protested unsuccessfully. Some of those samurai protested unsuccessfully. So in general, we have talked about 3 different non-European responses. We talked about the Ottomans, who were the first to modernize, put the brakes on some modernization, even using genocide to kill off people they thought were threats to the empire. We talked about the Chinese, who at first were against all things non-Chinese, realized that they need to up their game, even finally getting rid of their monarchy, getting rid of the emperor, an institution they've had for thousands of years in the name of modernization. And then we talked about the success of Japan, the country that realized that if they don't want to be conquered by the West, they have to look like the West. And they do such a good job that they'll even be in position in the 20th century to attack a part of the United States, Hawaii, and their desire to build an empire that looked like the rest of Europeans' empires did in the 20th century. Until next time, I hope you guys stay safe. I look forward to working with you again soon.